Welcome to Smalltalk Daily for Wednesday, July 7th, 2010. This morning I wanted to go over inheritance, which is one of the basic features of the class hierarchy in Smalltalk. Every class descends from another class all the way up to object at the top, and there's a little twist at the top with behavior you can look at. I'm not going to really cover that right now. But generally speaking, everything descends from object. Now it turns out you can subclass from nil and create your own independent class hierarchy, but that's not generally useful unless you're creating proxy objects, which is beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. So if you look at things like fraction, it extends class number, and if you look at class number, there's a whole bunch of things under. Let me scroll down a bit, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Let's take fraction and ask for its superclass. One of the interesting things is you can ask these questions all over the place. Let's go ahead and do an inspect it and see what it tells me. And it tells me that the superclass of fraction is number. Now, that's not terribly useful just looking at the inspector on that, but what I can do is I can send browse to things. So let's just change this to fraction browse and go ahead and do it on that, and you'll see what the hierarchy looks like. And in fact, what that does is it opens up a hierarchy browser. The refactoring browser kind of has two viewpoints. You can look at the package or the hierarchy. So if I look at the package, I'm looking at the code organization. If I look at the hierarchy, I'm looking at the way things are organized structurally. So here I see fraction descends from number, which descends from arithmetic value, and so on all the way up to object. And up in object, you see a whole bunch of basic messages that are understood by everything in the system, whereas down here in fraction, you see the things that are understood just by fraction. Now, this little notation here is in the browser. This says that this class has been extended within this package with some additional methods for the inspector. The general behavior is here in this one. You can see all the normal things, the arithmetic stuff, as, fixed point. These are coercion kinds of methods. So you can see all the basic stuff that makes sense. Going back over here for a minute, you can do the same thing for all these classes. If I look at small integer, date, rectangle, you can look at the way these look. Now, if you look at object all subclasses size, that'll tell you something interesting. Let's go ahead and inspect that. And that'll tell you how big the system is. Notice how fast it came back, but there's 5,938 subclasses of object in the system. And if I load things like OpenTalk, which is a distributed code system, you'll find there are a few additional classes again for proxies. But the way inheritance generally works is you define a class and then you define a subclass. So let's come over here to the definition of this, and you'll see I have smalltalk.core as the namespace defining class fraction, and then I tell it what superclass it has, and that tells me where the inherited behavior comes from. And inherited behavior basically means that all of that behavior is there as if it were in that subclass that you've now created, plus whatever additional behavior you create. Now it turns out that over time, we've moved kind of away from deep class hierarchies. Generally speaking, we don't think those are good ideas anymore. So when you're building new code, you probably want to have flatter class hierarchies and less inheritance. Things tend to get fragile. The more and more stuff you inherit, you end up with a class that has a lot of behavior, but a lot of it's so rigid you can't do anything. But there's a lot to explore here, so if you just go into the browser, you can look at stuff, see how things are implemented, and you can scroll through this introduction and see how things work. Now, one more thing I want to talk about. I mentioned that you can change behavior in a subclass. When you add a method that's already inherited in your class, it's as if that inherited method doesn't exist. You can still invoke it. As a matter of fact, you'll often see in the initialize method, and I'll show you this. Let's go to browse implementers of initialize. You'll see that there's a whole bunch of these all through the system. So you notice that the way most of these start is super initialize. What that means is I've got a class, I've implemented my own initialize to do extra stuff that I need to do in my own class, but up in the abstract superclass, or up in the superclass I've inherited from, I want to invoke all the inherited behavior. And in turn, it may go ahead and do a super initialize. Now this one's the top of the tree, so it doesn't do anything. But it may have a super all the way up to the top, depending on how deep that hierarchy is. And this is where you can get into that brittleness I spoke of. So this is a common technique in Smalltalk here, the super initialize thing, and it's something worth looking at throughout the hierarchy to see how things are structured. So that's about it for today. Until next time, have fun with Smalltalk.